Hey, so hello to everybody in the room and everybody over Zoom. Presenting over Zoom today, we have Dr. Chen. She's a professor from the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Dr. Chen's globally recognized research is in the field of language and literacy development among bilingual and multilingual children, as well as in dyslexia. For today's talk, Dr. Chen will be presenting her work on the profiles of struggling readers in English-French bilinguals. So you have the floor, Dr. Chen.
Um, so let me just get started. First of all, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research here. I had hoped to be in person, but because I'm traveling on Monday, there are a lot of errands to run. So I've decided just to present online, but I'm very happy to see so many people attending online and also in person. And thanks again for the opportunity. So I'm a language and literacy researcher, and I specialize on bilingual and multilingual children's language and literacy development. In recent years, my research has mostly focused on children enrolled in French immersion programs. I also have projects on Syrian refugee children and bilingual children from diverse backgrounds, but I do a lot of studies on English, French bilinguals. So today I'm going to present, hopefully it's 3 studies. If we don't have enough time, then 2 studies on the profiles of struggling readers in English, French bilinguals. As mentioned in the intro, there is still limited research examining bilingual children's development in terms of language and literacy. In terms of literacy, yes, that's also the case. So there not enough research. So it's an increasing number of studies, but our understanding is still fairly limited. Um, but one of the reasons is because examining struggling readers among bilingual children is very complex. So it's possible that children may have difficulties in one language, but not the other. So it could be in the first language, L1, but not in the second language, L2, or vice versa. Or it could be that there's an overlap of profiles in across the 2 languages. So there are a combination of possibilities. So therefore, this examining struggling reader profiles is much more complex in bilinguals than in monolinguals. So our lab is one of the first, not the very first, but one of the first to examine struggling readers among bilinguals. As I mentioned earlier, we focus on English-French bilinguals. I assume most people here are familiar with the French immersion programs in Canada. So these programs are set up for non-Francophone students, meaning they speak English or another language at home, but they're not native speakers of French. So here, the information I provide on this slide is about, it's based on TDSB, Toronto District School Board, but there is quite a bit of variation in French immersion programs across Ontario and Canada, so just keep that in mind. So here in the TDSB, 100% of language and content instruction is provided in French, beginning in kindergarten, and it continues to grade 3. Starting in grade 4, English is introduced, but it's only as a subject, so it's just an hour a day. The rest is still French, but the amount of French instruction decreases gradually, whereas the amount of English instruction increases over time. I think I could be wrong, but I think by the end, by grade 8 is about half and half, 50 English, 50% English and 50% French. So the goal of French immersion programs is to promote English-French bilingualism. So the idea is even though English is not a primary language of instruction, because children are, and they live in communities where English is the societal language or dominant language, they develop English proficiency anyways. At the same time, they develop French proficiency through school instruction. And however, so French immersion programs are highly successful in terms of promoting we call additive bilingualism, meaning children develop language and literacy skills simultaneously in both languages. So it's not that one language is replaced by the other over time. However, French immersion programs also have faced challenges. One of the challenges is that there's not enough support for children who are struggling readers or for children who have reading disabilities or learning disabilities. So over time, these children tend to leave the program and transfer into English programs simply because more supports are available. But one of the reasons for this is that it's very complex to identify struggling readers in French immersion because they're English-French bilinguals. So our research targets this issue with the hope that the findings can inform early identification and early intervention for struggling readers in French immersion. Okay, so study one is a 3-year longitudinal study. So we look at struggling reader profiles in English and French and how these profiles may shift over time. So this is based on the interdependence hypothesis proposed by Jim Commons, who was a professor at UAZ. That's where I am, but I think Jim's retired now. But the framework lives on. So according to this interdependence hypothesis, skills, language literacy skills developed in the first language can transfer to the second language and support second language development. On the other hand, skills developed in the second language can also transfer to first language and support first language development. So this is called cross-language transfer in bilingual research. According to this hypothesis, even though first language and second language may look separate, they have the same underlying proficiency. That's the iceberg is about. So they look like two different icebergs, but they're connected underneath. So if we apply this framework to children's reading profiles, then we can predict that there might be overlap of profiles between first language and second language. So if we're to be more specific, if we're talking about reading difficulties, so there may be children who have reading difficulties in the first language only. There may be children who have reading difficulties in the second language only, but there also may be children who have difficulties in both languages. That's the yellow portion between the two circles. But of course, there will be children who are typical in both languages. So it's kind of a 2-by-2 combination, but here we focus on struggling readers. Yeah. So a couple studies, actually not a lot. This is a very small field for now. A couple studies have examined overlap of reading profiles in bilingual children. So one study done by Menes and Lindsay took place in the States. They look at Spanish English bilinguals. They classify children into struggling readers in Spanish only, English only, or in both languages. And they found the overlap was about between 50 to 70% between L1 and L2. And then in Hong Kong, McBride Chang examined struggling reader profiles in Chinese English bilinguals. They also found an overlap, but it was lower. It was about 40%. And that's probably because Chinese and English are more distant from each other than Spanish and English. But to the best of our knowledge, no previous studies have been done in English-French bilinguals in Canada. So this is our study. So we had three objectives. The first one was to examine the extent to which those who are struggling readers in one language are also struggling readers in the other language. This was a longitudinal study from grade 1 to grade 3. So we look at this overlap between the two languages from grade 1 to grade 3. And then we also look at this issue called stability. So if you were a struggling reader in grade 1, would you still be a struggling reader in grade 3? How stable is your profile? And similarly, you could say if you were a struggling reader in grade 3, what was the likelihood that 3 years earlier you were a struggling reader in grade 1? So we call it prospective and retrospective stability. And then we also look at predictors of reading profiles. So we had some cognitive predictors. So this was a 3-year longitudinal study. Actually, it was a 4-year, but okay. So we started in kindergarten, but we didn't look at their reading profiles in kindergarten because they couldn't read at that time. So we assessed children on cognitive skills. But in grades 1, 2, and 3, we assessed their reading skills. We had 113 children in kindergarten, and then about half of them were girls, and we followed them to grade 3. As typical of a French immersion population, these children came from, I would say, middle-class families. So more than half of the mothers and fathers, they obtained university-level education. So that's a general criticism of this research. Because middle-class families tend to send their kids to French immersion schools. So in most cases, not in all cases, we still have some low SES samples, but in most cases, these samples tend to be high SES. Okay, keep going. So the measures were quite simple. As I mentioned, in kindergarten, we assessed them cognitive skills, nonverbal ability, rapid automatized naming, phonological awareness, and vocabulary. So these skills are considered predictors of reading. And then from grade 1 to grade 3, every year, we assess them on word reading in both English and French. In English, we used Woodcock reading mastery test. And then, okay, so in French, we use this measure, but the reason I didn't memorize the French measure was because we didn't use standard scores. Again, that's another criticism of research on French immersion children. Standardized measures in French are typically normed among Francophone children. But the norms do not apply to French immersion children who are second language learners of French. So in this case, we just use raw scores. Okay, keep going. So now I'm showing you the results. So this is the overlap of first language and second language word reading profiles. So the overlap is calculated in two different ways. That's why we have percentage of overlap in English versus percentage of overlap in French. In English, we took the overlap, that's the middle portion, L1 slash L2 poor word reading. And we divided it with L1 poor readers. So if you look at the bottom of the slide, is percentage of children who are poor readers in English and also poor readers in French. So it's the overlap of children who have both divided by the overlap divided by children who demonstrated difficulties in English. So those were the overlap in English. So we had here we can see from grade 1 to grade 3, it was between 50% and 80%. Okay. And now we can look at the French side of the thing. So it's children who had difficulties in French, but some of them also had difficulties in English. So it's the middle portion divided by children who had difficulties in French. And here, the overlap was actually lower. So if you look at these numbers, it was from 38% in grade 1, 32% in grade 2, and just about 18% in grade 3. I hope I made that clear. So there are two different ways of calculating the overlap. You could either use L1 as a baseline or L2 as a baseline. Okay, so this slide shows the stability of reading profiles. So first we looked at retrospective stability. So if a child was a struggling reader in grade 3, there was about 80% chance that that same child was also a struggling reader in grade 1. And then if a child was a struggling reader in French in grade 3, I was talking about English before, so 80% for English. But if a child was a struggling reader in French in grade 3, it was about 87% chance that the same child was a struggling reader in French in grade 1. So both were significant, indicating there was stability retrospectively. But we can also look at the stability the other way. So from grade 1 to grade 3. So if a child was a struggling reader in English in grade 1, there was about 40% chance that the child will remain a struggling reader in English in grade 3. So 40%. And then the same prospective stability was 44% for French. So it was a bit lower when you look at things prospectively versus retrospectively, but that makes perfect sense. So the children who still struggle in grade 3, we can be sure that those are truly struggling readers. So it's very likely that they were already struggling in grade 1. But if we look at children who struggle in grade 1, there may be a bit of noise in the data. Maybe children are just starting to learn, starting to receive reading instruction. They're not very mature. There are other factors. There's noise in the data. So the prospective stability was a bit lower. Okay, moving on, and then we can look at predictors of struggling readers. So here we use the kindergarten cognitive skills to predict reading profiles, I should say 4 years later, or 4 years later in grade 3. So the predictors were measured in English. That's because English was children's either first language or stronger language. In kindergarten, they knew very little French. So these skills were all assessed in English. And then the profiles would so the outcome was assessed in French. That's because French was the goal of instruction for French immersion programs. And consistent with our expectations, we found that both phonological awareness and RAN, rapid automatized naming, were significant predictors of children's reading profiles in French in grade 3. Yeah, so that was study 1. So I will summarize the findings quickly. So we found that struggling readers in one language were also likely to present as struggling readers in their other language. So in other words, there was significant overlap in struggling reader profiles between L1 and L2, and we found it across all 3 grades. So this finding supports the cross-language transfer and also the interdependence hypothesis. So remember, we look at overlap in 2 different ways, and we found that the overlap was stronger when calculated based on the number of poor readers in English, suggesting that children who struggle to read in English also struggle to read in French. That makes sense because English is their stronger language. So in French, again, there may be more noise in the data because they haven't had a lot of exposure to French. Instruction was limited to the school setting. So English seemed to be a more robust predictor of their overall struggling reader profile. In terms of stability, we found that children with low word reading performance in grade 1 were likely to remain poor readers in grade 3, and also vice versa, suggests that word reading challenges are relatively stable. So it's not a problem that will just go away on its own. So it really requires, intervention. In terms of predictors of reading profiles, we found that cognitive skills measured in English in kindergarten predicted status as poor reader in French in grade 3, again providing support to the independence hypothesis. So that wraps up study 1. And now I'm gonna move on to study 2. I'm gonna have a much easier time with study 2 because it's quite similar to study 1. Okay, so here we also have 3 objectives. So this is based on another longitudinal study, but it's a separate data set. So this is important because study 2, to a large extent, replicated the findings of study 1, but we also extended study 1. We had some new findings here. But in terms of objectives, they were quite similar. So study 2 also had 3 objectives. The first one was to examine the extent to which those who are struggling readers in one language are also struggling readers in the other language across grades 1 to 3. Here we didn't have kindergarten, so it was a 3-year study. And then the second objective was to investigate whether there's a difference in the overlap of struggling reader profiles in English and French when classification includes word reading accuracy and fluency compared to word reading accuracy alone. So here is an extension from study 1. So in study 1, we only looked at word reading accuracy, and we found that the struggling reader profiles were better identified based on English than in French. But here we thought, word reading actually consists of 2 aspects, accuracy and fluency. Why don't we look at both together and then see how the 2 languages compare to each other? And then the third research question was, again, a predictive question. The goal here was to examine the likelihood that first grade struggling readers will exhibit the same patterns of word reading profiles in grades 2 and 3. Okay. Yeah. So similar setup. So children, we had 169 children in grade 1. About 93 girls, so slightly more than half, and they were assessed in the spring of grades 1, 2, and 3. And again, majority of parents had university level education. Here we had more data, more demographic data. About a third, little less than third children were multilingual children, meaning they spoke another language at home, so they were not English speakers at home. Okay, so here we had word reading accuracy and also word reading fluency as our measures, and these 2 skills were assessed in both languages in each grade. Okay, so now we can look at the results. Here we have 2 sets of results. So I'll ask you to look at the graphs on the left first. So these were the results based on accuracy and fluency. So basically we made a composite score, and then we look at the percentage of overlap in English versus the percentage of overlap in French. So again, percentage of overlap in English referred to the percentage of children who were struggling readers in English who were also struggling readers in French. So first they had to be struggling readers in English, and then some of them also struggled in French. So that was the percentage. And we found that in grade 1, it was about 68%, and then it increased in grade 3. So by grade 3, we had about 82%. And then we can look at the percentage of overlap in French. So these were the children, first they struggled in French, but some of them also struggled in English. So it was the overlap divided by the overall number of children who struggled in French. Interestingly, we found that here the percentages were kind of similar between English and French. So in English, we had 68%. In French, we had 69% in grade 1. And then in grade 2, in English, we had 64. In French, we had 56. In grade 3, the overlap in English was still higher, 82%. And in French was a bit lower, 63%. And then if we look at the circles or the chart on the right, these were the results based on word reading accuracy only, because we wanted to look at this to examine how, in study 1, we only look at accuracy. But in study 2, we look at both accuracy and fluency. So we wanted to compare the two approaches. So here we found that the percentage of overlap in English was about 65% in grade 1. Interestingly, by grade 3, we had 100%. Again, showing that if you use English as the base, there was more overlap. But if we look at the percentage of overlap in French, it was significantly lower. So in grade 1, it was only 32%. And then in grade 3, it went up a little bit, but not by a lot. It was only 42%. So if we compare the two approaches, we kind of concluded that it was useful or helpful to also consider word reading fluency when we identify struggling reader profiles in bilingual children, because when we included word reading fluency, we found that the percentages of overlap were more balanced between English and French. And then we look at stability profiles. Again, this was kind of similar to study 1, but we build on study 1. Remember in study 1, we only had English to English from grade 1 to grade 3, French to French from grade 1 to grade 3. But here we had the study 2 had larger samples. We thought, well, why don't we look at 4 combinations? So you could be typical in both languages, you could be a struggling reader in both languages, or you could be a struggling reader in first language only, or a struggling reader in second language only. So the bilingual struggling reader was a new feature for study 2. So we found that if you were a bilingual struggling reader, meaning you struggled both in English and French in grade 1, there was about 47% of the chance that you were also a bilingual struggling reader in grade 3. You still struggled in both languages. And I guess the analysis was significant, indicating there was stability. So if we look at the other side of the coin, if you were typical in both languages in grade 1, that means you didn't struggle in either English or French. You were a typical reader in both languages in grade 1. And then there was a 87% chance that you were still typical in both languages in grade 3. Again, the analysis was significant, indicating stability. But we can also look at children who struggled only in one language. So if you only struggled in your first language, in English, in grade 1, where would you be in grade 3? Interestingly, we found that they no longer struggled. All of them, 100%, well, there were only 6 of them, but all 6 of them became bilingual typical readers in grade 3. And if you look at children who struggled in L2 in French only in grade 1, we found again, most of them grew out of it and they were fine in grade 3. So 80%, 4 out of 5 were typical in both languages in grade 3. That means only one child was still a struggling reader in grade 3. So if we look at the stability across the different profiles, I think we can conclude that it's important to consider both languages because children who were identified as struggling in both languages, so about half of them remain to be struggling readers in both languages by grade 3, whereas those who were identified as struggling readers in one language only, either L1 or L2, most of them, the vast majority of them, were no longer struggling readers in grade 3. Okay, moving on. So both down here, so overlap, that is, so we found that struggling readers in one language are also likely to present as a struggling reader in their other language. So this finding is consistent with, again, the interdependence hypothesis and theories of cross-language transfer. So compared to study 1, we included word reading fluency in the study, and we found that based on the findings, we concluded that it's useful to have both accuracy and fluency because including fluency captures more bilingual struggling readers compared to reliance on only measures of word reading accuracy. So in terms of stability, we found that high stability of status as a struggling bilingual reader. Again, if you remember, if you struggle in both languages, then you're likely to still struggle 3 years later. So this finding suggests that identifying co-occurring L1 and L2 word reading difficulties may help efforts to enhance early and accurate identification of children with a significant and persistent reading impairment. On the other hand, we also found that if children only struggled in one of their languages, they tend to catch up with typical developing peers by grade 3. So this finding further highlights the benefits of assessing both languages and considering other factors that may account for difficulties in just one language. Actually, I still have 5 minutes, so I'm just gonna fast forward to show you a little bit about my study 3. The overall setup is similar, but here is in addition to poor readers, we also have poor comprehenders. So those children were defined as children who had average or above average word reading skills, but they struggle with reading comprehension, so we call them poor comprehenders. So this is quite interesting. This is a larger study. I wish I had more time. So basically, we look at children not just in terms of their word reading skills, but in terms of both word reading and reading comprehension skills. What we found was in English, in grade 1, we only found poor readers. Grade 2, only poor readers. This was a latent profile analysis. But then in grade 3, we found that this new profile emerged. We still have poor readers, but now we also had poor comprehenders, meaning that children who are okay with word reading, but they struggle with reading comprehension. So that was quite a novel finding. And then we didn't find that in French. Across all 3 grades, we only found poor readers. Let me see if I have time. Okay, I'm going to show you the next slide before I fully wrap up. So we also look at stability, but this is more complex because we have poor reader, that's PR. AR is average reader, and then we have poor comprehender, so that's PC. So if we look at English latent profiles, so this is actually latent transition analysis. So we want to look at how children transition from one grade to the next. So if we look at children in English in grade one, poor readers, about 71% of poor readers in English in grade one, they were still poor readers in grade two. So that suggests a quite pretty good stability from grade one to grade two in terms of stability. But if we look at grade two to grade three, then among the poor readers in grade two, about 59% of them were still poor readers in grade three, but about 20% of them became poor comprehenders. That means they improved their word reading skills, but now they struggle with reading comprehension. It could be that they also struggle with language proficiency or some other cognitive skills, such as reading strategies. So that's quite interesting. And then the average readers. So this is average readers in grade two. Most of them were still average readers in grade three, so about 75%. But 25% of them, they slipped. They became poor comprehenders in grade three. So we thought these findings were really interesting. But when we look at reading profiles in French, again, we used latent transition analysis to look at the transition between grades. In grade one, for children who were poor readers in grade one, only about 46% of them were still poor readers in grade two. And another half, 46% of them, sorry, became average readers in grade two. It shows some stability, but not quite as good as in English. But when we look at the transition between grade two and grade three, it was really high. It was 96%. So this shows that in French, the stability was much higher from grade two to grade three.